Just to give you a heads up, the final stave for a Children Rekindled Christmas Carol is coming out around December 23rd. Posted on the CR Twitter account, sorry for the delay. Yeah, like I'm the one that needs to hear apologies for delays. Well, I'm back again with a continuing look at the Children Rekindled project. Last time I covered Bonfim's Children Rekindled, we left off at Chapter 12 in the main story, as well as brought up the first stave of the Children Rekindled version of A Christmas Carol. This time around, the Christmas Carol story has been finished and a new chapter was released for the main comic. So in the spirit of the season, we'll cover how Bonfim approached the Christmas classic in some rather unique and interesting ways, before returning to some scary ghost stories. Hey, that song Most Wonderful Time of the Year said they were a part of Christmas, like with caroling, so remember that if you ever want to share this around the fireplace next year. If you haven't seen my previous video on Children Rekindled, the short version is that it's a fan comic of the Five Nights at Freddy series that focuses on the ghosts of William Afton's victims and gives new perspectives of the series' events through their eyes. It's one of the most impressive things I've seen involving the franchise, because it gives not just a focused and interesting story, but well-made characters that made it very easy to become invested in them, and show sympathy at the path that led them to become the murderous animatronics of the series. Just like the games, the fan comic is generally dark in terms of the circumstances, but a lot of positivity, hope, and levity is spread throughout it as well, especially when a new set of kids become victims of Afton and begin trying to help the original group find a new way forward. And if you didn't see the explanation in the previous video, Bonfim and the rest of the comics team are very clear they're not following the canon of the games as strictly as they could, for the purposes of story, character development, and generally trying not to be as convoluted as the games were to casual readers. It turns out this same goal was applied to their version of A Christmas Carol, though it is still mostly a faithful retelling of it. The cast are still the characters they were in the comic, taking their characterizations and backgrounds and transplanting them into the roles of the story. This not only lets it have its own flavor and presentation of A Christmas Carol, but winds up shedding more light on the cast, while at the same time being a respectful retelling of classic literature. Well, Christmas classic for people that actually care about it. If you're not into Christmas, the story, the holiday, you don't believe in all of it, whatever, then stick around, because there's still more to the story that I think is interesting besides just the holiday stuff. Not to mention seeing what Chapter 13 is like later on, but for now, let me turn off the preamble rambling and get on with it. As we begin, Francis takes the place of Scrooge as a cynical, cold-hearted miser, putting up with the world around him, as well as his employee Daniel, taking the part of Bob Cratchit. He's interrupted from his work at the counting house when Poppy and Kenny come in to invite him to their Christmas party. In the original story, this is Scrooge's nephew Fred doing the inviting, but in this adaptation there isn't any relation between them. It probably has something to do with preserving the ages of the characters, but like I mentioned earlier, keeping the characterization of the kids intact while still having a place for them in the comic that's natural for them. And here early on, we not only see direct references to the original story, but also how well it was mingled together with the Children Rekindled story and setting. While telling Poppy off, Francis says if he had it his way, every idiot who goes around saying Merry Christmas will be put inside an oven and cooked with their own turkey. If you read or know the Children Rekindled comic, you might think this was put in there specifically as a dark reference to how Charlie was killed by Afton. It turns out, the reference is being made using a near quote from the original story, with the original quote being, "Every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding." I'll leave the direct references to A Christmas Carol alone for the most part from now on. I will, however, focus on what is shown about the characters and how it reflects on their portrayals in the Children Rekindled comic. As Daniel lets out the first visitors, a couple of charity workers looking for donations to help feed the poor and uplift their spirits arrive. The twins Chloe and Connor take this part, possibly reflecting how, as older teenagers compared to the rest of the children, they either have or begin developing feelings of some sort of responsibility toward the other kids, especially as things keep happening. Francis drives them off with words like, if the poor are to die, then they should do it and decrease the surplus population. And yes, Scrooge was this big of a dick in the original story. In fact, this adaptation leaves out the part where Scrooge chased a caroller away from his business with a ruler. After telling his employee that he can have the day off for Christmas, with the caveat of coming in early the next day to make up for it, Francis heads home for the night and begins having visions. Before much longer, the sounds of bells ringing and heavy chains moving through the house herald the arrival of Sammy White. Of course, this is the place of Jacob Marley's ghost, and in both instances, they're the long-dead business partner of Francis or Scrooge. The chains that weigh him down are of his own making, and he's been allowed to warn Francis of the chains he's making for himself if he doesn't change his ways. Now, by this point in the comic, since we haven't gotten to chapter 13 yet, Sammy is one of the more complicated characters that I've discussed in there. His depiction as Marley's ghost, and the rest of the souls that surround him, hint to us that there's something wicked about him. I mean, he is the one that convinced the rest of the children to possess the Freddy robots and start their killings, in a blind hope that they managed to get Afton. Yet by being the one that warns Francis in this adaptation, it shows there's some kind of regret or desire to know he's doing the right thing with his actions. There are, after all, darker and more evil parts that Sammy could be playing in the Christmas Carol story. And the way Sammy acts in this adaptation keeps his childlike trollishness instead of the pure dread Marley had in the original story. After giving Francis a few scares at what being a ghost like him is like, Sammy tells him that the only way he'll have a chance to avoid the same fate as him is with the help of 3 other spirits that would be visiting him. With the warning given, Sammy's chains and the winds that bore them begin to pull him away once more. The last Francis sees of him is with other cursed souls, forced to be bound in their chains for all eternity and never having eternal rest. As Francis comes to terms with what he saw and goes to bed, once more dismissing it all as humbug, the stave ends with an apparition watching over him as he sleeps. Stave 2 begins with Francis drooling on his pillow, there's some of that levity, before a bright light awakens him, the ghost of Christmas past. This part is taken by Charlie, fitting for one that's childlike in the original story, and her hair seems to be styled so as to reference the original story's ghost as having light like a candle or flame shining behind or around their head. Now I say Charlie is a fitting character to use for the Ghost of Christmas Past, but as the adaptation continues, we'll see evidence that the ghosts are based off of the characters, but not using the characters. We'll get to what I mean in a little bit. The ghost responds to Francis trying to brush off her offer to help him by rewording the offer as saving him, then has him take hold of her arm as she flies him through the skies and into the past. They travel the town of Francis's childhood, coming to a school where he was left long after hours by his mother. Now, as I said before, I'm not going to delve much into the direct references to the original story, but this stave involving the Ghost of Christmas Past is where a lot of divergences are made, primarily because of how the characters are in the original comic, and making them work effectively as those characters in this adaptation. And since Francis doesn't have any other family, a lot of the family that would show up here in the original story for A Christmas Carol isn't available to be used. However, in the original story of A Christmas Carol, it was Scrooge's father that left him behind. And Francis does seem to have issues with his parents of some sort in the comic, since in a flashback at the end of Chapter 3, it was suggested that they didn't celebrate his birthdays. His mother was still shown to be worried about him, though, so as it's discussed in this adaptation, in the case of Francis, it was probably along the lines of being strict or something, and not deliberately or willfully abusive or neglectful. Speaking of his relationships, Francis is next shown witnessing a Christmas party held by his former employer, John. John is one of the newer main characters in the Children Rekindled comic, and there isn't much to say about his usage in this adaptation, other than, assumingly, since he was a teenager compared to Francis being 12, he's given the more mature role of being his boss. But again, that might just be another example of Bonfim trying to use the characters where they would make the most sense. And speaking of references, this is a party with music supplied by versions of the Freddy Fazbear characters, as they would be portrayed in the 1830s. The costumes effectively being stitched together out of sackcloth, but we'll see there's a sort of franchise for them in this setting of the time period later. The big moment of this scene is seeing a happier version of Francis sharing a dance with Charlie herself, seeming to blossom into her becoming his girlfriend for a time, before he ends the relationship later on to focus more on his business. And this is where Charlie as the ghost comes back into discussion, since I doubt Charlie died and would become the ghost later on, only for Francis to not make any sort of comment about it. There's the real Charlie we see in the flashback here, the one that Francis weeps over losing and heavily regrets doing so, and the ghost taking her form as if transplanted from the Children Rekindled comic directly. In any case, this part reflects that there were hints given Francis and Charlie would have or could have had a thing together in the main comic if events played out differently. And there's always a chance it could still happen. But I might be reading too much into it, and it might not be much more than just Francis seeing her as a closer friend than the rest of the group. However, her being used as the lost love in the adaptation makes me wonder. This memory of loss, however, stirs Francis to anger, and as he shouts at the ghost for making him relive such a time in his life, he grabs the oversized metal cap she was carrying with her and forces it over her head, extinguishing the ghost as if the flame of a candle. Stave 2 ends with Francis back in his room, sobbing over everything he witnessed, as a light comes from a nearby door. Stave 3 gives us the Ghost of Christmas Present, represented by Bianca, a perfect fit considering her fun-loving personality in the main comic, at least while she was alive, but quick to shift into a serious demeanor when called for. Like in the original story, the Ghost of Christmas Present flies Francis around the town, spreading just a little extra cheer for everyone they come across, until they find Daniel with his sister Mina. The kid sister of Daniel we only saw briefly in the original comic, as she was first learning of and dealing with the news of Daniel not coming home ever again. Bianca told Daniel in the comic that he was the best brother ever for her, and here in the adaptation we see that. No matter how much struggling he goes through or how poor he is, he makes the best of it for himself and his sister. Unfortunately, like Tiny Tim, she's wasting away from an ailment, and the ghost warns a legitimately worried Francis that she won't live much longer without better care than what Daniel can give her. And like in the original story, the ghost throws Francis's words back at him and says Mina should hurry and die to decrease the population. As the weight of his words settle into him, they come to a new scene of Poppy and Kenny taking part in a Christmas party with the rest of their friend group from the main comic. Again, from my previous video, I said there that it would be nice to see more of the side characters, especially in regards to how everybody was in life, and was focusing on Poppy and the rest of Kenny's friend group, since they seemed to be able to help him open up. It looks like I got my wish a little bit here, because instead of Scrooge's family hosting the party, it's Kenny and Poppy's friend group. A short look into them, But they are enjoying their time together and playing guessing games while making fun of Francis and what he said when they visited him earlier. Considering how Children Rekindled went, I'm really happy to see Kenny having a good time with his friends. As Poppy raises a toast to Francis and wishes him cheer even if he was a grump, the scene begins to fade as Christmas Present begins to fade as well. Being a ghost of the present, after all, only gives you so much time to be around. But Francis sees one last thing before it's over. Claws grasping at the ghost's robe. And our introduction to ignorance and want. For all the changes and reshuffling of character relationships in this adaptation, it looks like Bonfim didn't want to skimp on these two, and for good reason. Just as in the original story, Francis is terrified of the little nightmares as the ghost warns him to not fall for what they represent. And in this moment where Francis begins to realize and turn away from what he was before, being warned that ignorance and want will exist as long as he and others like him allow them to, the spirit is gone. And Francis is left with only one last visitor. Now, to return a moment to ignorance and want, considering who they were in the original story was creepy and wretched children, I had no idea what they would be represented by in this adaptation, considering everybody's children. Now, using the Nightmare animatronics might be, I don't know, sort of simple reference or something like that. You know, it's the fan comics, Five Nights at Freddy's, haha, we snuck it in this way. But I think there's a little more to it than just a simple, easy reference. Yes, Children Rekindled is based off Five Nights at Freddy's, and by extension, so is this adaptation of A Christmas Carol. However, if we keep in mind that these two characters are meant to be symbolic of the vices of ignorance and want, then I believe having them be not Nightmare, but the Nightmare versions of the Five Nights at Freddy's mascots fits fairly decently. After all, a lot of the tragedy in the Five Nights at Freddy's series and Children Rekindled is coming from the willful ignorance and want for money from the Five Nights at Freddy's franchises. And considering how much attention to detail was put into not just this adaptation, but the Children Rekindled comic as well, then I think it's safe to assume that's what they were aiming for here. So to summarize this tangent, while it would have been nice just to see ignorance and want represented somehow to begin with, it's a fairly clever way of doing it, if that's what they intended, or even if it's not what was intended. Stave 4, The Last of the Spirits. And honestly, I would have expected Kenny to be the spirit, considering his mostly mute and judgmental personality as a ghost in the main comic, but Michael taking the place works just as well, considering how Michael doesn't want his friends to be doing the killings in Children Rekindled. A nice joke here about wearing a hoodie in the 1840s, though. I guess if you are a ghost representing the future, nothing can really stop you. However, how things are presented in this small part here is where I think something slipped in terms of keeping with the story and actions of Scrooge in the original story. Francis and Scrooge both discuss that they fear this phantom the most and know that he'll show them what may come in the future. Francis, however, skips a couple lines and ends the moment with saying that the night is short and time is of the essence to him, in a way that makes it sound like he has a "let's get this over with" attitude. In the original story, Scrooge actually says, "As I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear your company, and do it with a thankful heart," saying this before bringing up that time is of the essence. In other words, by skipping that bit and giving Francis this expression, the adaptation winds up losing a part of Scrooge's character development that was making the reader of the original story begin to root for the old man's success in his journey. Instead, Francis comes across as doing it just because he's scared but knows he has to put up with it, which is actually a common thing done in Scrooge analogues and other adaptations, especially shorter ones. I don't know if this was intentional or a side effect of paring down the dialogue, but considering a bunch of other things that were referenced or quoted, I'm a bit surprised that part was left out. Returning to the story, the ghost presents random people in the streets of the city making merry about the death of someone. The group is represented by newer characters of the comic, Jess, Ron, and I think that's John again. It would make sense for the friend group, and as the simplest explanation, I'll go with it, leaving alone things about being the boss in the flashback. Anyway, they discuss getting together to have some fun at the dead guy's funeral, with Jess mentioning that she'll see if she can get Paige to come along. A reference, I'm sure, to their characters in the main comic, where Jess had a private crush on Paige before they all died, and here it seems to imply they're together in some form, either as friends or more. Next up, the ghost takes Francis to a pawn shop where a bunch of people are selling the possessions they nicked from the dead man's property. And... wait a minute. Is that Elizabeth Afton as the fence? Okay, context time. Elizabeth Afton is, in the Five Nights at Freddy series, the victim of and the ghost inhabiting the circus baby animatronic. In the old version of Children Rekindled, called Children, Elizabeth was mentioned along with Ben and Alice as other victims that Chloe and Connor were with for a while. My understanding, based off a post, is that the current version of Children Rekindled wasn't going to use those characters anymore in the comic. So seeing her and the others brought back for this side story is actually pretty interesting on my side of things. Speaking of references to the old version of Children, yes, this is obviously leading up to Francis being the one who everyone is celebrating died in the future. It was obvious it was about Scrooge in the original story as well, but the focus wasn't so much the mystery about it, but Scrooge and Francis being in denial over it. However, what I'm bringing up here is that you might have noticed everything Francis had was, in a general term, Foxy merchandise, down to his slippers. If you only read Children Rekindled, you would think this is a reference to his ghost possessing the Foxy animatronic. Going all the way back to Children, however, this is probably also a reference that in the old version of the comic, Francis actually made it clear he was a big fan of Foxy, unlike his portrayal in Children Rekindled, where he dismissed everything about Freddy Fazbear as kid stuff. Also, Michael as the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come gets a chuckle out of me for playing and fiddling with a Freddy doll while all this is going on. Now, like I said, Francis is in denial that he's the one dead, and returning to the character development Scrooge was showing in the original story, Francis states that he understands the lesson being shown him, even if it's presented from the death of somebody like him, but not him, but is cut off when presented a shrouded body before him. He refuses to look underneath it, and frighteningly demands to be taken from there. The ghost places him in a cemetery, where Francis witnesses Daniel crying over the grave of his little sister Mina. A sad reversal of what happens in the main comic. With one last thing to see and questions to be answered, Francis begs to know first if this is the future that will always be, or if it is one that he can still change. And with the sight of his own grave, unmourned and uncared for, Francis finally breaks down and promises to not just understand the lessons he has learned, but to prove it by living them. He declares he is not the man he once was, and begs for the chance to prove it. And what I think is an addition to the story, begs that if he himself cannot be saved, then for the ghost to at least save Mina from her early grave. The weight of his emotions, guilt, and regrets crushing him, Francis weeps at the grave while Stave 4 ends and Stave 5 begins. Francis opens his eyes to the sunrise, and realizing that he's still alive, prances and dances about as he thanks the spirits, which Sammy's ghost comes back to accept the thanks for as one last bit of fun. not knowing what day it is, Francis calls out the window to a passing Cal and Sonny from a Memorial. Damn it. Sorry, I don't know why I keep laughing at this part so much to myself. Probably a little bit of how much I've discussed Amori on the channel in different ways. And probably also the fact that I know this is exactly how Kel would rope Sonny into doing an errand for the neighbors. Anyway, Francis learns it's Christmas Day and gives the two a side quest to go get the biggest turkey in town and deliver it anonymously to Daniel, saying he'll pay them extra if they do it quickly. Well, took that to heart, didn't they? Francis then catches up to the charity workers and promises a hefty donation to them, and makes his way through the town to accept the invitation to Poppy's Christmas gathering, spreading cheer and well wishes to all he comes across. At the door, he takes the time to apologize for what he said and how he acted, but accepts it when Poppy turns him away regardless. Kenny, however, steps up for him and convinces Poppy that he seems genuine and they should invite him in. The scene ends with Francis hoping to challenge the group to some guessing games, but there's still a little more to see. The day after Christmas comes, as Francis is waiting for Daniel with a scowl on his face, seemingly back to his old ways as he berates Daniel for showing up late. Daniel tries to protest, including mentioning a mystery turkey that arrived, but Francis won't let him squirm out of what he's got coming to him. A big raise to his salary and a pile of laughter from Francis at the joke he pulled. There's a little thing here in the original story where Bob Cratchit actually considers knocking Scrooge out and putting him in a straitjacket, worried that he actually has gone crazy. And I was half expecting this adaptation to include that part somehow, considering the rest of the humor and levity it's sprinkled around, but I'm not counting it against it or taking points off or whatever. And just as like the original story ends, so does the adaptation, with Francis becoming an infinitely better man to all those around him, and becoming a second brother to Mina, who he helped recover from her illness. In the final lines, we have the immortal send-off of A Christmas Carol. Get a bit of a send-up where the narrator stumbles over how to integrate it into the script. God bless us, everyone. I'm going to have to mark this as one of my favorite adaptations of A Christmas Carol. It didn't come off as plain, and had the characters do their own thing, as they would be expected to do if they were being themselves, at least generally. And if you didn't know where they originally came from or how they acted, it's still good fun, and there's nothing lost from that. However, using his own characters didn't stop or prevent Bonfim from keeping the adaptation the closest to the original story that I've seen. This was mostly in lines of dialogue and little things like the bakery being where the ghost of Christmas presents spread her cheer, but also in spirit when it became necessary to change things, like with references to Freddy Fazbear being used as a place of employment, I think, or using the relationships of the cast in different ways to try and keep them in roles expected for them to play without compromising or changing what the roles were in the original story. This anachronistic mixing of things works out in the end, and doesn't make the story feel timeless, but reminds us that the story will always be timeless. So for those of you that don't celebrate Christmas or don't care about it for one reason or another, like I hinted at the beginning, here's where we get into what the more interesting takeaway is from this story. In my eyes, the original Christmas Carol story goes beyond beliefs, religions, cultures, whatever. The point of A Christmas Carol, and by extension just about any of those other Christmas specials or stories, whatever, that have the whole thing of, oh, it's the most wonderful time of year, it's Christmas, and it magically makes everybody feel better. Whether they intend the message to be this or not, is that when you have an excuse, a holiday, a birthday, just a nice day outside, something that makes you smile, if you have all these things that give you the excuse to be a better person, First off, why wait for those days? And second off, if you can't be a good person on those days where it's supposedly easier, or you just have a better excuse to be nice and a better person, then when the hell are you going to be one? Strip away Christmas from the setting of the story, and nothing really changes about the story. It will always be about a man learning from and being humbled by what he's done, how others are living, and what kind of future he will make for himself and others around him. But even taking that away and stripping it down to that, it doesn't cheapen what the story presents to us and the morals it wants to get across to us. This was actually a real treat to read, Bonfim, and I'm glad you made it and shared it with all of us. And speaking of sharing, I also know that Bonfim had something to do with some sort of Pinocchio comic. I don't have the links ready for that, but they're on his Twitter, so feel free to visit his Twitter and look at all the cool things he's done there. And speaking of other comics he's worked on, it's time we get back to Children Rekindled, with Chapter 13. It opens with Sammy hiding in the box of the puppet, singing the lyrics to the song of the puppet's music box, titled My Grandfather's Clock, for those curious, and clearly falling apart while doing it, as he presumably reflects on all the spite and hatred he's been getting, as well as his failure to stop more murders despite what his plan was. He's interrupted by Lily calling out for him, trying to apologize for how John treated him and the others, and comparing Sammy to a snake. Not in the way you'd usually think of it, but instead saying they bite and hurt people only when they're angry or scared, and saying that she knows that's what's going on with Sammy. He eventually starts to open up and respond to her, and she tries to give him one of her sea snake pins as a gift to help him feel better. Turns out, however, ghosts can't get rid of things that are connected to them, like Sammy's knife is permanently stuck with him. But Lily finds a way around that by holding on to Sammy, so the pin is technically still connected to her through Sammy as he takes it. I'm sure this is going to be foreshadowing for something, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head. He tears up at this again, and this might actually be one of the few, if not only times, he feels like someone's actually giving him some kindness after all these years as a ghost. I mean, constantly trying to talk people into being killers doesn't help him, but as we saw, Lily actually tried talking through the reasons he acts like that, and seems to have gotten through to him. The comic moves on to show the new kids discussing which robots they've chosen to possess, with Francis laughing his ass off when he realizes Ron chose Balloon Boy. Ron defends it by comparing it to playing a support class in Dungeons & Dragons. Nerd that likes D&D in the 80s. Fully understand that outcast status now. While Paige talks about how she's strong and willful enough to crawl around without her legs, and controls the pile of barely functioning scrap known as Tangle. Backing up Ron's choice with hers by saying she picked it for the challenge, Paige is also confident she can start swinging around and climbing walls with it. Yeah, want to guess how Tangle acts in the game? Meanwhile, John is noticed to be acting a bit out of sorts and withdrawn, mentioning he thinks Lily wants some time to be alone and brushing off questions if something happened. Lily then returns with Sammy, to everyone's annoyance, saying he deserves to be there while they plan their quote-unquote detective stuff. Francis responds to this by pressuring Sammy to tell everyone what his plan was and always has been. The same thing he told them their first night and what he convinced them of. Sammy responds by saying he thinks they should try to make sure they find the right guy instead of killing willy-nilly. Okay, I'm not going to bring this up to pat myself on the back or anything. I think it was fairly obvious that they were using the characters in the Christmas Carol comic to give us ideas of how the actual characters are in Children Rekindled. So I don't see it as a surprise that we see, what I said about him being Marley's ghost, because even though he had evil actions, he wanted to make sure he was doing them for the right reasons or wanted to repent himself. That feels obvious, not even in retrospect. The point I want to bring up here, though, is that now that it's making me think of it with Sammy being revealed this way, if there weren't already plenty of other hints about it earlier, like, him wanting to bring everyone together, him actively being a ghostly friend for Kenny for about a year or so. Yeah, about a year, I think. Then, what else did we see in a Christmas Carol adaptation that is hinting at or foreshadowing something in Children Rekindled? This triggers one hell of an outburst from everyone, breaking out into arguments around Sammy as he deals with all of what he's hearing, as well as, most likely, the realization he pretty much confessed to himself that he's been in the wrong for all these years. The argument stays heated until Bianca puts an end to it all with a big shut up, saying that they all want to come up with a better plan than what was going on before, and that part of the argument is over with. Almost a kind of mirror of when she also shouted down everyone at the start of the comic, when they first argued about Sammy's plan, and then went off to do the first killing to spare the others from getting involved with it, while also attempting to prove Sammy wrong. As they discuss things, though, something John says here will become important later on. The plan they agree on is to let the new kids, in the form of the toy animatronics, do their thing for one night while the rest of them hang back. If they don't figure out anything, they'll talk more. Speaking of talking, there's a bit more going on over in the office. We open to a new night guard being hired, and if you're a fan of the games, Mr. Fitzgerald just got your attention. Yes, we are now at the cusp of the second Five Nights at Freddy's game, and Jeremy Fitzgerald here is actually based off the winning design of an event the Fancomics Discord server had, with the winning character design submission coming from none other than Broken Mirror. She's made a lot of fan art of Children Rekindled, is working on a fan game of the fan comic, and is the one that suggested I look into the comic in the first place. So a big congratulations to her for having a part to play in the comic. However, Jeremy's time in the comic is suggesting that he has an agenda for getting this job in the first place. Now, at first I thought he was using an alias based on something from the games and something from the original version of Children, but in terms of the game character being used, I'm not entertaining that idea anymore on the grounds that it would have no real impact or ties to the rest of the characters in this comic. I do wonder if he has a connection to the other children in this version of the comic, though, which could lead to interesting situations if some of the children know him while the others are trying to target him. But in the end, he could be any random guy around town, or even a private detective looking for answers undercover at the behest of the families. Because as John pointed out, killing the guards could scare the real killer away. But to logically think about that would only scare the killer away if word got out that something was killing the guards. The one kid's Polaroid from early on in the comic might not be available to the police, but maybe the kid still talked. Maybe rumors got spread. And as more deaths and disappearances happen, the rumors start to make some kind of sense. After all, during this conversation, it's mentioned the phone guy moved to the day shift, so he's at least one guard that survived the animatronics trying to kill him. And there might be plenty more. In any case, regardless of who or what he is, his comment when he gets behind the security desk makes it clear he wants to be there. Now Ron spots him on the phone and hurries off to warn the others. And with the words of, "I guess we're doing this then," the comic ends at the start of the second game. The epilogue for this chapter once more gives us a flashback, this time to Sammy. We find out that Sammy was taken to Fazbear's to pass the time after missing their plane home to the UK, seemingly from some sort of booking problem. But also, it's been so long since he was a ghost that Sammy can't remember what his own parents look like. A fate that not only helps empathize with him about his mania and his helpless feelings, but also a tragic fate that may be coming for the rest of them in time. I said it before and I'll say it again. All the kids in this comic deserve a hug for what they're going through. I get the feeling the next chapter will be a major turning point for everyone involved, including the reader. Whether you know anything about Five Nights at Freddy's or don't, I believe what we've seen here is great writing and great presentation in both of the comics. And for that, I will completely hold them in high regard. And I've played the games, I've played fan games, and I've dug some deep holes into the lore, trying to figure out all I can in preparation for these Children Rekindled videos. Of all the things that are out there that I've seen directly or heard about, and there's some that I haven't, feel free to bring them up if you think there's something else out there worth looking into. I look forward to Children Rekindled the most. I think it's one of the best things in the franchise as a whole, and I truly, legitimately hope that somehow it can get more views and more attention on it than it's had so far. This project as a whole, whether it be Children Rekindled or the Christmas Carol adaptation, especially in terms of Children Rekindled, however, this shows us how a story can be made strong and engaging for the readers when you have strong characters and give them interesting and engaging character development. I keep saying these children in the story need a hug, and that's just how engaged I am in the story. How much I want to see these characters come out better on the other side and not just constantly be stuck in this torture they're in. Check it all out if you haven't already. It's a fan comic, it's free, it's easy to find. And once more, always support the creators and official releases out there. Because even if you don't like them, you'll never know not just who else might like them, but who else they can inspire to make something good. So that'll be it for this video. I'll see you all again soon, and in the meantime, take care. No, really. See you again soon. Scrapnik Island video is pretty much finished and will be up next week, and other stuff I'm working on aren't as involved to get done. I guess what I'm saying is, Happy New Year! I resolve you'll have more stuff from me than before.